Hey there, CALC here, and in this video we're going to take a deep dive look at the oscillator section of the Summit Polysynth. Without any further ado, let's jump straight in. So we're going to take a good look at the oscillators in this video, and obviously the controls and all of the various things we can do with it. But before we do, I want to take a moment just to consider the technology that we have in the Summit synthesizer. Summit, like its precursor, Peak, the 8-voice desktop version, is based around hybrid technology. That means that we're using both digital and analog aspects to generate the sound. The analog side is the filter section, fully analog, the mixer with the VCAs, we have analog amplifiers, and also the overdrives and distortions are all pure analog. The digital side, however, is in the oscillator generation. But rather than just using a traditional synthesis type, we're using a different type of processor called an FPGA, a field programmable gate array. Now, in a traditional synthesizer, you would have a DSP processor followed by a digital to analog converter. This converter would be using a sample rate to generate the sound, much in the same way as you would find on an audio interface. For example, it could be set to 44.1 kHz or 44,100 times a second. It will draw the wave shape. Now, when designing the Peak synthesizer and of course the Summit synthesizer, Chris Huggett, the lead engineer on this instrument, found an incredible way of being able to use the FPGA to get a much higher resolution. So whereas we would be using traditional sample rates in a DSP-based synthesizer, using the FPGA, we can actually access the numerically controlled, that is to say mathematically generated waveform shapes at the same speed that the processor is running, which is a huge 24 megahertz or 24 million times a second. This is an enormous boost over the speed and resolution that these numerically controlled oscillators can be generated. For example, if I initialize the patch and go to a sine wave here now, for every second of the sine wave that we're hearing, we're getting 24 million calculations to generate that sound. It's an incredibly fast and powerful processor. The other big advantage of using an FPGA is, unlike a DSP processor, which has to send big long streams of code to basically generate and control the sound, the FPGA can be split into various different sections that can run simultaneously. This means that the FPGA is a much more efficient type of processor for working in this kind of world. Now, of course, we could have gone full analog, and that perhaps would have been a cheaper option than using the FPGA technology that we have here in Summit. But we didn't really want to build an instrument that we could have done 40 years ago. We really wanted to push forward the technology and the capabilities of something like a modern-day synthesizer. It's true to say that the traditional analog wave shapes, sine, triangle, sawtooth and square waves, are all being generated at this super high sample rate. So all of the issues that you might find with digital synthesizers, i.e. aliasing and artifacts being present in the sound, are completely removed. In fact, it's impossible to discern any difference between these digitally generated oscillators from the FPGA and true analog oscillators. One of the big advantages of having a digital generated oscillator is the fact that we can, of course, create our traditional wave shapes, sine, triangle, sawtooth and pulse width, but in addition, we can also use wavetables. And each of the three oscillators here has access to 70 different wavetables in the wavetable list. So let's take a look at the controls we have for each of the oscillators. Now, Summit is a 16-voice instrument, so we have 16 individual notes that we can play, but each of those individual voices has 3 oscillators. That means in total we have 48 oscillators being generated in Summit, which is a huge amount. Now, in terms of the controls, let's start on the left-hand side. I've initialized the patch here, so we're just on a basic sawtooth wave shape, just coming from oscillator 1. So, the first control you'll see is this range control, and this defines the octave range in which the oscillator is working. So, we have 16 foot for the low end, 8, 4, and 2 foot. Basically, they're like octave switches for your oscillators. In addition, we have a coarse pitch control, which goes an octave either way. And we also have a fine pitch control, which will take you a semitone either way. So we've got a lot of very deep control here over the tuning. The next control is, of course, one of the most important switches on the Summit itself, and this is the waveform control. So here we're just on a basic sawtooth, and you can see this here on our oscilloscope. But if I move now through to, for example, the square pulse width, we'll go past more into the sine wave, and then obviously into triangle. So those are our 4 basic analog wave shapes, but of course we also have more, and this then will automatically open up the menu to the Wave More page. This is where we can access our wavetables. Next to our wave shape switch, we also have 2 normalized, that is to say pre-connected controls to some modulation effects over here. So for example, here we have mod envelope 2 connected to the pitch. So if I turn this up, you can hear the modulation envelope shape affecting the pitch. If I want to edit that shape, I can just switch here into my mod envelope number 2, and let's just make a different shape. So we'll add a bit of rise and fall to the sound. Next to the mod envelope 2 control, we also have direct control over the pitch with LFO2. Let's just experiment a little with that. The LFOs run into really high audio rates, and we can get some almost frequency modulation style controls using them. Now the next control is a very interesting one, and this allows us to further shape our oscillators. This is particularly useful for the wavetables, where we can scan through up to 5 different waveforms using the shape control, but also when we're using our traditional analog wave shapes, we can also use shape to add extra tonal qualities to the sound. So here we are on a sawtooth, and if I use the shape control and you look at the oscilloscope, you can see I can essentially change that into a double saw shape. If I move backwards, we get fairly similar response. But equally, I can also modulate these, and again we have a dedicated control that is connected to mod envelope 1 here and also LFO1. So let's add a bit of movement to this sine wave using LFO1. You can immediately hear how that waveform is now being interacted using LFO1. Now this control is actually 3 separate controls in one pot, and we can move through the different types of controls using sources. So here we have LFO1 being applied to the wave shape, but if I go to my manual control, I can also choose the starting point for that as well. So this is also working in conjunction with the LFO. Let's also add some modulation envelope 1 to it as well, and make a shape here with the modulation envelope controls. So you can see we can get a lot out of traditional analog wave shapes that traditionally don't allow for us to control the shape as we're doing here. If we move to the others, for example, here we go to the triangle wave shape. I'll initialize again and we'll move through now to our triangle wave shape. Now once again I can use the shape control here to give us wave folding and add extra flavour to the sound. If we go to our pulse width, the shape now becomes the actual pulse width control for that wave shape. We can even go to 0 and stop all the energy from the oscillator being provided. Again, I can apply LFO to this wave shape as well to get more traditional pulse wave modulation. Now, of course, one of the huge aspects of the Summit synth engine is the fact that we have access to all of these wavetables. So I'll initialize my patch again, and this time I'm going to move through to where we have more on our wave selector switch. You'll notice this has automatically opened up the screen and has given me access to Oscillator 1's wavetable list. I can choose a wavetable by using the value switch here, or I can use the encoder to quickly scroll through them. So let's stick with this wave shape, and you can see here on my oscilloscope we've got quite an interesting shape already provided. But now using the shape control we can scroll through our various different stages of the wavetable. And this allows us a huge amount of sculpting of the sound even before we're going anywhere near any of the filter section. And of course this can also be modulated using an LFO if we want. With the huge amount of wavetables available within the Summit, you have an enormous palette to start your sound sculpting, even at the oscillator level. And of course we have 3 oscillators. So let's just bring in another oscillator. And of course if we just detune that a little bit, we'll start to thicken up that sound. So we've looked at the top panel controls for the oscillator, accessing our different wave shapes, shaping them with the control here, and also accessing our wavetable menu. But we also have an additional oscillator menu here. So let's go into the oscillator menu, and here is the first page, the oscillator common controls, page number 1. So I'm just going to go for a single oscillator and play some octaves. Now you can hear at the moment that everything is perfectly in tune. We're just hearing a single oscillator playing 4 individual notes. Now this is one of the real advantages to having digitally controlled oscillators, because we don't have any unwanted variation or unwanted changing in the pitching of the notes. Some of the instability that you can find with analog oscillators. However, obviously that instability can have a huge impact on the sound. So with the Summit synthesizer we have a diverge control. So I'll just play an octave again here, and this time I'm going to change the diverge. You can hear instantly that that thickens up the sound. Let's take that off again. Very flat and static. Just change the scaling of the pitch. Diverge control basically adjusts the scaling of the keyboard. If we want to, we can also add drift, which is again a similar kind of phenomenon as analog synthesizers being retuned and detuned by the temperature and environment that they're in. Now with drift we will actually get ever so slight movement in the pitch tuning of the oscillators. Again, remembering this is just a single oscillator playing a sort of wave shape that has a very nice traditional analog feel. I can also change the tuning table that I'm using. At the moment I'm just set to a traditional well-tempered piano tuning, but we can explore tuning tables in another video. The second common oscillator page allows us to key sync the oscillators. Now let's bring it back down to a single oscillator. Let's take all the diverge off and the drift. Now Keysync is off by default. Now basically the oscillators are all running individually on each of the voices. But if I need to sync the oscillators so that they're all perfectly in phase with each other, now we can do so. This is particularly useful when we're working in the FM world, as keeping everything in phase can have a much more harmonically pleasing effect to the sound. Underneath the Keysync controls, we also have controls for 2 filters on the noise oscillator. We have a low pass filter to get nice low noise, and we also have a high pass filter to let the high frequencies pass through. Then we move into our dedicated oscillator menus, and we can see here this is labelled Oscillator 1, and this is where we can access our wavetables, much in the same way as if we choose the More option from the wavetable. Underneath that, I can also set a fixed note. So if I want one oscillator to lock onto a particular note and not move as I play around on the keyboard, we can do so. I've set Oscillator 1 here to C2, which means that regardless of which note I play on the keyboard, it will always play me back the note C2. If I bring in the second oscillator now, you'll see how Oscillator 2, which is not set to a fixed note, can also move around the keyboard while the first oscillator is held in place. Directly under the fixed note, we have an individual bend range attached to the pitch bend here for each oscillator. So for example, let's drop down the bend range here to +3, a minor third. Remember, we have Oscillator 1 and Oscillator 2 here. Now if I press a note, Oscillator 1 will move up a third, while Oscillator 2 will carry on the full octave. This can be very useful in getting nice harmonic changes in between the oscillators as you use the pitch bend control. The next page gives us some additional controls for the oscillator, including virtual sync. One of the big advantages of the Summit synth engine is that we don't need to directly use each of the oscillators to sync with the other oscillator. We can use what we call virtual sync to do this. So here is a traditional sawtooth shape. Let's sync that now. I'll just latch the key on. Let's sync this in. And you can hear that virtual sync kicking in and giving you the sync sound. Of course, we can sync with any style of oscillator to get that kind of sound. Of course, we can use the modulation matrix here to also set that up to be controlled by whatever we like. So perhaps we will use LFO1, we'll go to Oscillator 1 Virtual Sync, add some depth, and now. If you want a more traditional pitch control over the virtual sync, we can do so by going to the modulation wheel here and using this. The final controls we'll look at now are the saw density and the density detune. This works specifically on the saw wave. So here we have a traditional single sawtooth. If we increase the saw density here, you can see now how we're actually getting movement in the oscilloscope there. If we take the density detune out, you can see we get a fixed wave shape. Using the detune, we can actually knock these out of tune and give a much more kind of traditional analog feel with that. Again, using the additional shape control, we can actually create a 3 sawtooth wave shape. So the final thing we'll look at now is using the Unison mode to stack all of these voices on top of each other, and we access this from the voice menu. So here we have a single oscillator, and if I go to my voice page, here's the Unison. You'll see now my voice page here. Now we're in this mode, I can now use the Unison control here to add an extra voice. We now have 2 voices playing, 3 voices playing in unison, 4 and up to 8 voices in unison. Of course, this is just a single oscillator at the moment, and again, if we use the diverge control here and also unison detune, we can get some huge sounds from just a single oscillator set to a sawtooth. Now if we bring in the other oscillators, you'll see how much power we actually have. In effect, we're listening to 24 oscillators in this mode. So that was a section dealing specifically with the oscillators. If you want to learn more about the different aspects of the Summit synthesizer, check out the other videos that we've been working on to go through the filter, the FM and the modulation controls and such like.